And of course, those of you who have been preparing for the Academic World Quest Knowledge Competition know that the battle of the century, autocracy versus democracy, is one of the themes this year. And so I'm extremely pleased to introduce two people who are friends of ours, colleagues and partners who've helped our program over the years, who are going to be here speaking to you about on their views on this theme. And then we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A once again. So I encourage you now, start thinking of those great questions that you have, because after their remarks, you'll get a chance to ask questions, and maybe even those questions will help you in tomorrow's competition. So let me first introduce Dr. Karen Adams. She teaches rights about international relations and human, national, and global security. She's published articles and chapters on great power politics, the strategic effect of military technology, and the causes, conduct, and consequences of war. In 2014, she was named a super forecaster, the Good Judgment Project, 4-year study of geopolitical forecasting sponsored by the CIA's U.S. Intelligence Advanced Research Projects. Dr. Adams traces her interest in global security to growing up near the Rocky Flats nuclear weapons complex near Denver during the Cold War and traveling to China with her great aunt in 1984. I love that, Karen. I'd like to hear more about that sometime. When the Chinese government was beginning to allow more Americans to enter the country. She will be joined by Ambassador Robert Loftus. Ambassador Loftus served in the U.S. State Department and Foreign Service from 1980 to 2012, where he held a wide variety of assignments, including acting coordinator for reconstruction and stabilization, special representative for avian and pandemic influenza, senior advisor for security negotiations and agreements, ambassador to Lesotho, and deputy chief of mission in Mozambique. He was most recently an interagency professional and resident at the United States Institute of Peace. He served as the Deputy Commandant, Senior Advisor for International Affairs of the Industrial College of the Armed Forces at National Defense University, where he also taught strategic leadership. Ambassador Loftus was the lead negotiator for a status of forces agreement in Iraq. He was also the Deputy Executive Director of the Implementation Planning Team for the creation of the Department of Defense's new Africa Command. Please help me welcome Ambassador Loftus and Dr. Adams.
Have a diplomatic agreement to sit down together. Hello, I'm Professor Adams. I teach here at the University of Montana in the Political Science Department. My expertise is in international relations, and I have a particular focus on international security and national security, which historically means causes of war, conduct of war, alternatives to war. And increasingly, over the last 20 to 30 years, has been redefined to include a broader array of threats, not just war, and increasingly to think climate change, for example, global pandemic diseases. So I have, you heard my biography, and I realized I left off a really important part. Something that actually came before I heard about my 1984 trip, my great aunt when I was in college to China. She was a teacher, and she was really interested in going to China. She was 75 the day we were on the Great Wall of China, so I made it possible for her to go because I could walk. But something that actually got me interested in international relations even before that was great decisions, which you are all participating in through the World Affairs Council. When I was growing up in a suburb of Denver in the late 1970s, 1980s, the church that I grew up in every year used the great decisions briefing books for community discussions. And that was when I really started to become interested in international affairs. It was really an interesting thing to think about the whole world, to think about my community in the world, and to think about ways that I could make a difference. And at that time, that was kind of the height of Cold War tension, especially nuclear tension between the US and Soviet Union. It was during the Reagan administration when President Reagan revised US military strategy to include preparation to fight and win a nuclear war. That really isn't possible. And so it was a scary time, and it was also really exciting to be part of this conversation. So I really want to congratulate you on being part of that conversation, and I'm looking forward to your question. Let me just polls here. I'm feeling a lot of you have quite a bit of experience on some of these issues already. I think this year, I heard this year, a former student, that one of the debate topics this year was great power conflict. How many of you were debaters working on that topic this year? And I'm one of the faculty advisors for the Montana Model UN High School Conference. How many of you came to the Model UN High School Conference in late November? Great. All right, those of you who don't have your hands up, talk to your advisors. We'd love to have you come to our Model UN conference. All right, well, today's topic is the battle of the century, autocracy versus democracy. What a setup, huh? You debaters already kind of know some strategies you might play with this one, right? Yes, no, maybe a mix. The premise is wrong, right? So the tack I'm going to take on this is that you are all probably still going to be alive at the end of it. But chances are, you may be quite old, you may be 100. But it's possible, especially in America today, lifespans are getting longer for a large part, not every part of the population, but hopefully by then we will have 30 lifespans. What will we think? Well, but what will you think was the battle of the century on January 1st, 2100? Chances are, frankly, I don't think it will be autocracy. I think it is going to be much more a question of human flourishing, human survival under brand new conditions, with climate change, with greater access to space. Now, all of those issues, those global challenges, are going to be very much affected by the way that we, the United States, as a democracy, define the challenges, by the kind of allies that we decide we can work with, and the countries that we are not to work with. And my position is that of the things that we could label global challenges here in 2023, I think it would be better, it would be wiser for us to think of these global challenges that people all around the world with their various governments are facing, and think about ways that we can address them constructively together. Of course, there's likely to be some competition, but I would like to think that we can have not a totally peaceful coexistence, a smart coexistence with states that are like us and with states that are next.
Good. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm a little bit older than a few years, and I grew up as an old man. Actually lived in my location, not all that far apart, also on the edges of my Mount Arsenal. So kind of grew up suffused with the idea. Union and there are other communist countries. And for the first half of my career, in the early 1980 up until the 1990s, that was the driving force. And whatever you were doing in American foreign policy, it was going to be about the Cold War. So I agreed that the idea that we have to cooperate with countries that have very different political systems from ours, that's a given. We had to do that with the Soviet Union, we had to do it with China, we had to do it with any number of other countries, very different. But I would argue that there actually is a contrast between democratic governments and authoritarian governments. That the United States needs to be, should be on the side of promoting democracy. And the reason I say that is because authoritarian governments, well, on the first instance, they tend not to respect the rights of their citizens. Moral imperative. But on a more practical level, they tend to be a lot less stable in the long term than they appear. Especially the model that we're looking at today, which is basically based on one person. When that person goes away, that society tends to collapse. The most extreme versions look at what happened in Libya after Gaddafi was deposed, what's going on in Venezuela. And so you're seeing where those countries are in essence exporting their problems. If you look at our southern border, for example, a large part of the migration that's coming in, illegal migration, is coming across because people are fleeing crime, they're fleeing poor governance, they're fleeing the lack of economic opportunity, and that's all being driven by authoritarian governments that don't really look that closely at the citizens. Probably the biggest example right now is Putin in Russia. I mean, almost across the board, not just driven by the war, but across the board by all of his policies, the quality of life in Russia is going down. It's not just the Ukrainians that are suffering. You have literally hundreds of thousands of Russians fleeing the country. So one way or another, it's going to affect us. And I think we need to be on that side pushing for democratic governance. Now, the problem is that the United States has a really mixed record in promoting democracy. Look at what we tried to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, and I would say you would have to rank those as a failure. We have had better success elsewhere. The way that we do this, the most successful, is to step back and understand that all of these different societies have different ways of looking at democracy. And rather than us coming and say, okay, you have to have this American system, we have the parliamentary system, shifting our focus back to what it was, we first really started pushing this idea, which is part of the president, of a focus on human rights, particularly civil and political. And if we can help promote those by promoting civil society, by providing training, by stepping back a little bit, that's where I think you're going to get more democratic governments. Because a government that is protective of, or that promotes and protects the civil and political rights of the citizens is far more likely to be a democratic system. We've also run into problems by supporting regimes that are friendly to us or important to us because of natural resources. We turn a blind eye to their abuses. And of course, the biggest problem is that we don't always live up to our own ideals. And probably one of the best things we can do in democracy and promotion of human rights abroad is to live up to the ideals of our Constitution and our Declaration of Independence. For all of our we can talk specifics on what we do during the Q&A, but from my point of view, I like to be on the side of the good guys, cooperate with the bad guys, wash my hands afterwards if I have to. But I think it is in our long-term interest to be promoting this, but understanding that there are lots of ways to do it.
Right, we're ready for some questions. It looks like there are microphones up there. You probably know how to do this already.
Sure. So audience, there are two microphones, one on that side, one on this side. Start your lines, start questions, formulations. Don't be shy.
Cannot possibly have known.
Really set it up so that you've got truth.
Hi, this is a little bit high for me. My name is Megan. I'm from Gardner. You mentioned when you were talking that there are a lot of different ways to promote human rights and thus promote democracy. Could you give some examples of these ways?
Sure. So when I was ambassador to Lesotho, one of the things you have to look at is the country receptive to getting this? So Lesotho is a country independent since the early 1960s. It's completely surrounded by South Africa. Had a long history of military coups, long history of one-party rule. They had managed to have, finally had some free and fair elections. But the way the electoral system worked out was that one party won all of the seats, though they only won about 55 to 60% of the vote nationwide. So there was an attempted coup right after, in fact, right before, when my predecessor arrived in the capital. 6 weeks later, South African tanks were rolling across the border, helped put down a rebellion, and the city of Maseru was burned. Right? It's not a very big city, but still, it's the capital. I show up a few years later. The capital's been rebuilt. One of the things that we had done was work with the Commonwealth and with the United Nations to help them come up with a new system of parliamentary democracy. So in other words, so what we did was actually they adopted a combination of Israeli, New Zealand system, which guaranteed minority party seats in parliament. That really helped a lot. So we paid a large part of it, but we did not take the lead in doing it. And then we brought in the National Democratic Institute to help train political parties on very simple things like how do you organize, how do you canvass voters, how do you develop a party platform so that they could actually effectively in the election. Election happens right after 6 months after I get there. It's actually a very well-run election and completely transparent. We had a really good team of UN-led election observers. And then the former general, the guy who was the former thug, really to be true, starts claiming that the election was stolen. He starts threatening to have his boys, as he called them, out on the streets unless the election was overturned. My counterpart, the British High Commissioner, and I got together. Said, this is really looking bad. So we kind of operated without really instructions from our capitals. We invited the general to the meeting at the British High Commissioner's office. And basically I told him that we had gone through, I had been out until 3 o'clock in the morning helping counting votes. It was free and fair. I told him that if he continued to push and if there was violence, that I would make sure that everybody knew that he was responsible for it. And that all of this foreign investment that would be destroyed, the jobs were coming back, I would make sure that everybody knew that he was responsible for the job loss. He eventually said, okay, I'll control my guys. I said, you can have a demonstration. I mean, that's really fine. But he eventually, I mean, at the end of the day, nothing happened. And I wish I could take full credit for it, but the reality was if all of that other work before had been done changing the system, that would not have happened. You can't just go in and there's lots of techniques like that. Sometimes you have to be quiet. You look at Iran right now, we're very much supportive of all these young women. But for the United States to take any kind of leading role, we play into the hands of the Ayatollahs and say that they're nothing but tools of the West.
Thank you.
I guess my question, I was wondering if you could talk more about what what the U.S. has been doing to promote democracy in Southeast Asia regarding China and Taiwan and stuff.
Well, that's a great question. Several years ago in 2011, I went to Vietnam to give a talk to professors in Vietnam of law and politics. And as part of the U.S. State Department USAID program, where the U.S. had introduced Vietnam the first on the Chinese border and has times been occupied by China, really big country. There's like the elephant in the mouse story, right? And so Vietnam, which of course was our adversary during the US Vietnam War from the late 1971, 1972, now is a US ally. And we've been helping them build capacity to do various things in their economy in particular. The Vietnamese government was interested in sort of moving up the economic development ladder. And one of the big studies that the US had economic and other experts do in Vietnam revealed that one of the big problems in Vietnam was that there really wasn't room for people to disagree with, say, their professors or with their business managers or with the party leaders. And so the advice that was given from this partner and other development experts in the US was that very early on in the education of Vietnamese citizens, they needed to be essentially empowered to form their own opinions and learn how to express their own opinions. And so I was there helping faculty at the college level think about how to reorganize their classes to allow for some disagreement. And it was kind of an interesting thing because Ho Chi Minh is sort of like the George Washington of Vietnam, founding father, and led the war for independence from France, and then later icon during the US Vietnam. And so instead of, say, a department of political science, they had a department of Ho Chi Minh studies. It's an authoritarian state. It's very much like what Bob was talking about. It's a country that is communist. It has a communist party. Most of what it is a group of powerful individuals who are running a very nationalist seeming policy, largely for their own benefit. And so I read up on some in sayings, and it was really interesting because Ho Chi Minh often disagreed with himself. So I suggested to the faculty that instead of having debates about was Ho Chi Minh right or was someone else right, like which are your favorite part of Ho Chi Minh's writings? You know, which part do you think is most relevant now? So it's, you know, it's challenging in a country like that to try to find an entree that doesn't just scare everybody and close things down. But often in a country like that, a challenging country that was our adversary when I was growing up, even in a country like that, you can still find some agreement about the importance of improving the lives of people, working together to ensure that a big country like China stays within its borders and so on. So that's one of the reasons that I feel optimistic about cooperating, even with my like sort of right off.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm James. My question was, how can we sort of justify working with and empowering the autocracies that we supported, and also overthrowing the democratically elected governments that we didn't support?
Okay, that's the question. Ask you about problems. Parts of democracy. So, I mean, if you look at one of our closest allies in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, is not exactly a democracy. But when you're the leaders of any country have to balance a number of competing interests. Just use the United States as an example. I mean, one of the things that we want is cheap energy runs our economy, cheap energy runs the economies of those allies. And when those, whether it's oil or it's rare earth minerals or other things we need, there's always a reluctance to try and push those governments into major changes because, quite frankly, we don't know what's going to replace them. Whoever replaces them might be much more inimical to our interests. That's the rationale that's often used, and there is justification. When we have gone in and supported coups in the two that really come to mind for me are Iran, the coup that installed, or one that overthrew Allende in Chile. And part of this was driven by Cold War dynamics, thinking that, well, if you're anti-communist, if you're against my enemy, you're for me, which is a really bad calculation because it really doesn't take into account nationalists or state politics. Going back to this point about Vietnam. Vietnam was our adversary, but now they're looking at us and saying, we actually need to have American other help to stave off the Chinese. There are almost no instances that I personally would argue that it makes sense for us to foment the coup. Mainly because when bad things go bad, inevitably do, we get blamed for it. Even though I love the movies, but there is no way that the CIA or the United States government as a whole is anywhere near as powerful as Hollywood made. I wish we were. It would have been a lot more fun. But you can't carry off these coups if you don't have a lot of internal support. And when we start taking away the internal authority or the legitimacy of any other government, we take on that responsibility, and we're never prepared to really fully. So just if you ever find yourself in government, don't foment it.
Thank you.
I'll just follow up on that one quickly. I think it's important for the United States and other democracies to admit when we've made a poor choice. I think that is one of the strengths of democracy, to reflect on our decision making, to think about what worked, to do so openly. And there are good examples both in our own history. For example, Mike Mansfield, the senator from Montana, was very important in reviewing the operations of the Vietnam War as they were going on in the late 1960s, beginning sort of a movement in Congress to question why the U.S. remained there when there was intelligence that said that there was no way we were going to win the war. It's just a matter of when we were going to get out. So Senator Mansfield took a very brave position that I think made a really big difference for American citizens and for Vietnamese citizens and for other priorities that we had around the world. And we see that not only in the United States, but in other democracies. Canada, for example, I think is really a leader in terms of the strides that it's made in terms of recognizing the poor treatment of Indigenous people, indeed the genocide of Indigenous people that has been recognized by the government. So I think that's a strength of democracy. To look at things again and again and again, and to try to come to a consensus together, not only about what's the right way forward, but what can we learn from our mistakes and what mistakes we did so that we can run more cleanly and have others respect us for one of the strengths of democracy, which is really looking at things with a cold, clear view so that we understand objective reality and the challenges we face and the opportunities for all over the world.
Hi, my question is that, do you think that the economic system that a country follows plays a significant role in their receptiveness towards democracy? For example, do you think that a capitalist system is inherently more receptive towards democratic governing, or do you think that a communist system could be just as receptive?
In theory, you gotta go back to the original Marxist theory. It was a prototypical democratic system where everybody shared in proceeds. Reality is that in every instance that was taken over by elite, because they were directing where the resources were going, whom they were. So as a practical matter, if you have a command system, it generally tends not to be responsive. Capitalist systems, so you have to be careful because there is a whole range of capitalism. The way that we look at it, And I would probably argue that if you have a capitalist system that concentrates wealth into a very few hands, you may have the forms of democracy, but you may well not have real democracy, especially if that wealth controls information systems, kind of puts out there that if you vote a certain way, you know, your jobs will be transferred somewhere else. So it's not I would say on very, very general terms, the system that allows people to make more choices themselves about how they're going to live their lives and make their living is going to be more democratic. But just simply saying communists or man economy versus capitalism, I would be very careful about saying that, making those as absolute distinctions.
One of the interesting things that's happening in the world today is that countries are kind of moving towards a middle place there, where, for example, China has become more capitalist in some ways, especially at this individual level, in terms of a private property market and individuals being able to decide where they're going to work and so on. So from that point of view, there's been some liberalization in China. But of course, then on the other hand, the United States, in order to compete effectively with China, can't really pursue a trade policy. Because if you just sort of, let your companies go wherever they can make money in the world, and that creates a lot of challenges in the case of, say, a pandemic where we didn't have enough a lot of stuff that we needed, right? More expensive. And so we see countries operating more in the middle between capitalism and the state planned economy today. I think it's important, as Bob says, not to go too far towards state planning because, you think about, a large modern economy, millions, billions of people, that's just too many decisions for a leader to make or for leaders as a whole to track. The reason capitalism works is that nobody has to make all those decisions, right? Instead, individuals are making. That gives us a lot of flexibility and resilience. And so we don't want to lose that, but I also think it is important for governments to think about, how to protect their people from, inflation, from loss of access to healthy food, how to regulate emissions so that people don't breathe highly polluted air, which is one of the leading causes of shorter lifespans today. So governments have a very important role to play in the economy, sort of setting the boundaries around the economy. And it's interesting to me that we're seeing that convergence kind of from both sides that suggests that that is a fairly effective way right now for states to be working, even though they're quite different in other ways.
How do we find the middle ground between the two parties, basically Democratic and Republican? The past two elections have been really, it's a big one. How do we find that middle ground back to more people having a say in it besides just Republican?
I'll try to be really hard to be nonpartisan here. So the one thing that I would argue that the way to approach that great question is that more people have to become involved in the selection of candidates. In other words, if you wait to vote until you're given a choice between candidate X from the Democratic Party and candidate Y from the Republican Party, you're not really having as much of a say in the outcome as you would be if you were helping to choose who's going to represent you in the general election. And I think we see this on when you get candidates who are more extreme, the more ardent, kind of pushing extreme, kind of pushing out, pushing the envelope on this. Trying to, so if you get more people involved choosing those candidates, I think you're going to find more moderation. I've had this debate with my wife and others about term limits. I'm not a big fan of term limits in Congress. Because I think you just create another bureaucracy. What I am a big fan of, though, is actual redistricting in a way that creates competitive districts across the board. So if you know that if by winning the primary, you win the general election, I think that's polarized. If by winning the primary, you then know that you have to win enough independent other voters on the other side over, that's going to have a moderating effect. The other thing that I would argue, especially at a national level, is, this is going to sound counterintuitive, but I would actually pay legislators more so that they could afford to spend more time in Washington, where they could afford to spend time with their colleagues across the aisle, which is what they do, rather than immediately rush home to raise money or not being able to maintain two households. There's a lot of little things to do on that. But my final point would be voters have to be educated. You can't just look at the label and say, well, that's a Democrat, I'm going to vote for her, or that's a Republican, I'm going to vote for him. Really spend some time, go to town halls, real for your representatives. And then, this is a tough one, but voting for third-party candidates, a lot of times that's a protest vote, like we're helping to elect the person we want to elect. But until those third parties can actually gain traction, we're kind of.
Hi, so, economic sanctions and to promote democracy and to reduce big that's my question is whether you guys use economic sanctions to promote democracy means that you guys have positive effects of
Well, I would say that it's useful to think a little further even on that economic sanctions question. I would start with the question of what kind of economy is going to serve the United States and our allies and help us meet the global challenges that we have. And first of all, I would say that especially given climate change, we need to change our mindset about whether being efficient is always the best choice. So we saw this during COVID, for example. There was an efficiency model around vaccine production. That meant that Canada did not have any vaccine manufacturing capability in their whole country. So even though Canada is quite a wealthy country and has a lot of scientific knowledge, they did not have the ability, once vaccine patents and research were done, to actually manufacture those and get them out to their people. So given the kind of storms that we're foreseeing, the association between pandemic disease and climate change, we really need, as a world community, to have more defense in depth, right? To have more places around the world that have the ability to help themselves and help other countries when they get into trouble. So we need to abandon the pure efficiency model where everybody just specializes and we just barely make enough stuff. That, I don't think that's really going to work anymore for our community, even apart from this autocracy, democracy. We really need to think about how to make sure we have enough of the really vital stuff. So the other question that is important, of course, is given that we have this long trajectory of the century to think about it, this question of addressing global challenges, and then we have the short-term challenges of, say, with Russia, which is carrying out this devastating war against Ukraine that's affecting the world economy, affecting food supplies, affecting energy prices, and then the possibility that China will do more to help Russia. We have some, immediate term problems with China and Russia. And personally, I think it is appropriate for the United States and our allies to think about ways to rely less on China and Russia, so that we aren't as vulnerable to supply disruptions, we or they, that for political reasons, we don't want to trade anymore. So the United States, we have a tendency, I think, to think about economic sanctions too much from the point of view of the United States and who we're going to stop trading. But it's also possible that other states will choose not to trade with us on certain things as a retaliatory measure. Again, that ability to have alternative supplies is really, really important. The Biden administration has started talking about something they're calling friendshoring. Have you heard about that? That would be a good term to know for your trivia conference. It was a term that was coined last year. You can read about it in the New York Times. About cleaning up this term and that. And the term didn't actually make it into the Biden administration 2022 national security policy. You can kind of see the idea in there that, you know, given climate change, given challenges with Russia and China, we need to have more ability to, you know, be flexible in the face of natural disasters or political disasters. And one of those things, one of the things that will help us is thinking strategically about who are we going to trade with, what countries are we going to let our companies share, you know, sensitive information with, and so on. So it's a bigger answer, I think, than you probably were going for. But the basic answer to it is, I think that being very strategic about economics is very important, and sanctions may be a part of that.
I could add on to that briefly. The things about sanctions, they're going to be very broad. It's really tough to say that, okay, we're imposing sanctions on this government, this person is actually going to change their behavior. That would be hard to find a real example where that actually happened. But what sanctions do is that they can restrict the freedom, especially if they're targeted against individuals. They can restrict their freedom of movement, can restrict their ability to spend money themselves and families. But there is another piece of that which is important, which is that sanctions are very symbolic. And they may not necessarily change the regime, but people know about them. So if, for example, in the 1990s, I worked in Geneva as the head of our political section for the Human Rights Commission, AWQ Council. And we were working, at that time, Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest. And we smuggled out a videotape message for her. And one of the things she said was, look, we understand that the sanctions against the Burmese Myanmar regime are not changing their behavior. But what you're telling us is that you know of our struggle, know that we now know that we have support, and that's what gives us the strength to carry on. So I think that aspect of sanctions is important. Sometimes sanctions have unintended consequences. You know, sanctions were not all that often used up until the late 1990s. We had sanctions on South Africa, the racial policy. It actually pushed them to develop all sorts of alternatives to the things that they could no longer import, which made them even stronger. So you really got to be careful sometimes about what you're doing and understanding that sanctions do sometimes hurt the very people that you're trying to help.
Hello, I'm Alexa from Gardner, and I was wondering, how, since you talked about earlier with your experiences in the Cold War, I was wondering how you think that the Cold War and threat of mutual destruction has affected U.S. foreign policy and working with adversaries.
Question. Sometimes the mutually destruction, I think, kind of brought a little bit of clarity, that understanding that there were limits on how far we could push, and understanding that we needed to have a strategy of risk mitigation. opening up lines of communication, things, red lines, the beginnings of the arms control agreements that we were able to. So, I think that is actually critical, is understanding that in any debate or any conflict, the other side has a large voice. And as much as we wanted to impose our will, they can prevent us making conflicts of really devastating damage. In fact, really good life. I think we might have lost a little bit of that, understanding limits to power. I think it's probably a good thing to get back. And the other piece of that would be is to stop relying so heavily on military support elements of our foreign policy. Very attractive. It rarely provides any permanent solution.
I would just follow that up by saying, I think that nuclear weapons have had clearly a revolutionary effect on war since they were developed. They've made it much more dangerous, obviously, great powers to fight together, which is why we had World War IX, World War III. And I think that we should really appreciate the calming clarity that they bring to our relations with China as well, with also on North Korea. Really, the threat of nuclear retaliation is so dramatic that it just means you have to think twice before you, harm the interests of a state that has such weapons. Sometimes that's frustrating for Americans. I read today in the Washington Post a column by a retired American general. He was arguing, if we would just give everything to the Ukrainians that they asked for, then they could, hurry up and take over all their territory again. And, why restrict what we're giving them? Why worry so much about the threat of retaliation, nuclear retaliation from President Putin? It's a bit like being back in the 1980s. But, it's interesting to see those arguments coming again. And we need people to talk about how that's, there's a reason that that's dangerous. There's a reason that the Biden administration and other administrations are so cautious to keep force limited. And I think we should bring.
Thank you so much.
I'm Maya from Gardner, and I'm curious if you believe that international sporting leagues should stop big events in or allowing competitors from countries with poor track records of human rights or autocracy. For example, many Formula One racing drivers have protested holding races in countries like Bahrain or Saudi Arabia, but races are scheduled there every year. These events bring lots of attention and tourism as well, so I'm wondering what your thoughts may be on.
There's a side of you that says, you shouldn't do that. Should be providing material aid, support, moral support to regimes like that. There's another side of me that says, yeah, let's do it. The reason why I say that is let's bring a whole bunch of people into Saudi Arabia or any number of other countries and show that there's a whole different show that women can actually walk around just wearing, pair of shorts and a t-shirt and not completely destroy the moral fabric of the country. That's a good thing. One of the it's interesting. You go back, you tend to think of Korea as a well-established democracy, right? Up until 1988, Korea was essentially a military dictatorship. I mean, it had the form of democracy, but it was run by the military. It was an authoritarian state. It was a very close U.S. ally. It was the 1988 Seoul Olympics that was part of the impetus for opening that country and pushing a lot of reform in there. So, it's not a clear-cut answer, but I would come down on the side of, okay, if you're not completely silent, I mean, the sporting authorities have to say, for example, if you're wearing a rainbow t-shirt you don't get kicked out. If you're wearing a shirt that says, women's rights, whatever it is, you don't get kicked out from that. Is when sporting authorities completely cave to the control of the host government, then I would say we've got a problem. But if the sporting authorities, they actually have power if they choose to use it. Unfortunately, the sporting authorities are not exactly great examples of good governance. They are more interested in the bottom line. But these sporting events can actually be important.
Thank you.
Hello there, I am Dio, coincidentally also from Gardner. I was wondering, as people who have experienced and worked in this for so long, and within the past 10 to 20 years, what are some of the best and worst decisions upheld by democracies, and why are some of the reasons they chose that?
Can you repeat the question? Some of the best, what kind of decisions?
Some of just like the best and worst decisions upheld by democracies, and why were those plans followed?
Okay, well, I'll start. The worst decision of a democracy since 1990, when the Soviet Union fell apart, was invading Iraq in 2003 by the Bush administration. And we continue to live with the effects of that. The United States still has military forces throughout the region. The ISIS, the Islamic State, really, got going over time as a result of insurgency that developed in response to the U.S. invasion. All sorts of effects domestically and internationally from that, and they continue to roll on. I think the effects of that will roll on for another 20 to 30 years, if not longer. It's a really, really an unfortunate decision. And the decision was also made, I see, in a way that really tells you about the benefit of open discussion and democracy. President George W. Bush and his advisors kind of gamed out, what did they think was going to happen? What were they doing? Why were they going to do it? What did they think was going to happen? And they didn't really ask for any kind of, alternative scenario. Now, I just want to say here that, since the Soviet Union fell apart in 1990, 1991, fell out of great power status in 1989, the U.S. has made a lot of poor decisions, predictable poor decisions that you would expect from an unbalanced great power. In other words, from it being the only superpower remaining in the system until 2015, when China rose to great power status. You would predict any country, democracy or not, is going to make a lot of unforced errors in a situation in which they don't have a peer competitor to make them think twice. So it was an equal opportunity set of mistakes. You see it with George H.W. Bush, with President Clinton, with George W. Bush, with President Obama, all the way down last year, President Obama's administration was when things started to get a little bit smarter, in my view, because China was looking a lot scarier and making us think twice. But all of those other presidents, Republican and Democrat, took a lot more care about deciding what were they going to do, getting contrary opinions and so on. And that really saved us from equally bad situations that could have been carried out. Now, you might think I'm sounding like kind of a softie here, but let me say that you've probably heard of Niccolo Machiavelli, right? Often regarded as one of the sort of uber realists of history, right? He wrote a book called The Prince, where he advises the ruler of Florentine city-state in the Renaissance to develop more military power, centralized military power, to use the iron glove and the velvet fist, if necessary, to make Florence into the new Rome. Well, Machiavelli, after he was exiled for criticizing leaders, wrote what was the more important, the Republic. And in the Republic, he argued that again and again, we see authoritarian leaders fail because they fail to take advice from a range of different perspectives. So they make unforced errors where they think that they're so powerful, nothing can ever go wrong. And that's really our best example of that is Iraq in 2000.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Braden, and I was just wondering, considering Israel's treatment of the Palestinian people and the question surrounding Netanyahu's corruption, should the United States step away from supporting this? Is there a line that the United States is willing to work with these people that do or don't harm the true safety that democracy here?
You're saving like one of the hardest questions to the last. So Israel, to my mind, poses one of the real interesting conundrums in foreign policy and motion. Because if you look at the notion of Israel as a Jewish state, it's often been said Israel can be Jewish or it can be democratic. And both. They're going to hold on to the territory holding. They're going to have a significant part of their population are non-Jewish Christians. Up until fairly recently, that has not been that difficult of a question for the United States. We have criticized Israel quietly quite a lot. Of course, there is, and particularly over their treatment of Palestinians. What complicates matters now for the United States is sort of several different things. One is demographic changes in Israel that are resulting in policy. It's kind of a little bit apparent where every election is decided by one member of parliament. If the vote goes one way, you've got a labor government, or if it goes the other way, you've got one led by Netanyahu. You've also got a very different dynamic with Israel than Americans' relations with Israel than you have with almost any other country. And that is the role of very conservative Christians in this country and the role that they see Israel playing in biblical prophecies. So you get this really interesting political scientists, very interesting dynamics of American domestic pressure. The only other thing I can think of would be Cuba, where American domestic pressure much larger role in our relationship. The problem also is that you have a situation where somebody once said of Yasser Arafat, he never missed an opportunity to miss an opportunity. Right, so there was always this. Every time there was a chance where you might have some sort of accommodation, Palestinians would not take. They wouldn't take 80%. They had to have 120. So you have this long buildup, this absolute too. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration, I think, got really right was in promoting the Abrahamic Accords to what peace between Israel and a number of Arab states. I think things were moving in that direction anyway, but they pushed it over the line. But what they did is that they did that at the expense of states, and which you're beginning to see now. You kind of see this coming 2 years ago. You really see it now, where this Palestinian frustration really began. I went to Israel in 1974, and then I went back in 2016. I'm not sure which changed more, Israel, or certainly my perceptions of it. But go there now, and it feels like there's a gigantic wall separating Jerusalem, with guard towers and all sorts of other things there. I mean, the Israelis are really facing a very difficult period. I mean, they need to make that decision. I don't think, we have a political commitment for Israel's survival. I think we need to give that. If not, it still needs to be very much more. But I think we could be a bit more vocal in pushing them towards an accommodation with the Palestinians and pushing the Palestinians as well. This is a two-sided affair. But And part of the problem is that, is also, I'm gonna get to your earlier question, is that Benjamin Netanyahu is not Israel. He's a politician, right? So criticizing him is not anti-Semitic. When you said you are, I think we just have to. We can be a little bit more honest, I think, criticizing Israel without calling into question our commitment to their continued survival. Actually, pushing to live up to their ideals. What we do, what France should do.
And so is there a line between Israelis, like is between that, in between, and in their views of is there like a middle ground, or is it really just a spectrum? Just like interpretation.
I wouldn't really agree to. I would not say that, the Israelis don't treat Palestinians. That's but then the Palestinians also don't treat them. There are two sides. There are it's a long-standing conflict where when I was in Israel, we met with actually one of the chief Israeli negotiators in Palestine. I think he described it well. He said the problem between Israel and Palestinians is that you have two damaged people that have been damaged by history. They are still so much suffused with their own pain that they can't see the humanity of the other side. I think part of our role is to help them do that. They have to take the lead. Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs is much harsher in many ways. It is really pushing them out of their culture, sending them to education camps, forced sterilization. It's significantly harsher, and it's not co-equal. Uyghurs were one attacks on Chinese.
Hi, I'm James from Bozeman, and I was curious in regards to election observers, how effective you think they've been, or how important they've been in promoting democracy.
Election observers can be really, really helpful, but you have to be there like 2 months, 3 months in advance. If you show up as an election observer the day of, you've missed everything that's gone on beforehand. So, for example, let's say in Zimbabwe, where you have non-OPF thugs running around beating up any opposition member weeks before the election happens, so that none of the opposition shows up to vote, and then you show up as an election observer the day of, and you see it's nice and quiet, people are lined up peacefully and casting their votes, you could come to the mistaken conclusion that this was a free and fair election. Clearly it wasn't. So that's part of it. You're observing the entire process, not just the day of the election. A lot of times what election observers do is just by bearing witness, they are deterrent to manipulation of the vote. So I think it's actually a really good thing to have international election observers work. And what's actually, thank you. I'm sorry, I'm rambling a little bit here. But it's really good to have international election observers working in tandem with domestic civil society election observers as well. Because part of what you want to do as an election observer is to help build up that local ability to monitor elections, to run them free and fairly. Also, what you can do is you can provide advice how to run electoral polls. When I was in Mozambique, they had their first full election since the Civil War. And a huge percentage of the population is illiterate. So when the ballots were not just the name of the political party, it was their symbol, and everybody knew what the symbol was. And your voter registration was not just your name, it was your name. So part of the electoral observation process is helping them figure out how to actually run the elections as well as just simply watching, not just simply being advised. As I mentioned, when I was in Lesotho, I was supposed to be an observer, do nothing else. But at 3 o'clock in the morning, as we're going through literally every single ballot by candlelight, you kind of found yourself sitting next to people going, okay, this is a valid vote. This one is a little bit more questionable. Let's talk about it. So, yeah, I'm a big.
That's a good example of something the US calls capacity building. And I like that kind of approach because often it's initiated by the country in question. They come and ask for help to help them with the challenge that they know that they face. And a lot of times it is kind of a sort of no-brainer from the point of view of the US, like why can't you have an organized election, right? But it actually takes, institution building and experience, a series of experiences and so on to build local capacity. And I think that's one of the ways that the US has been extremely effective, not only with regard to elections or, economic activity, like I was describing, say, in Vietnam, and education. We also do some capacity building with some of our military allies. So the reason that I like that model is that it is an agreement between two countries that is often initiated not by the US until we know we're responding to real desires on their part, not just we're kind of forcing. And I just want to say something about President Biden's national security strategy. I mentioned to you, it came out in October 2022. And our topic is autocracies versus democracies. And one of the threads in President Biden's national security strategy is, the US standing up to authoritarian states, and especially the administration said China, because China isn't just an authoritarian state, it's also the other most powerful country in the world besides the US. So it's the conjunction of China's being a superpower and its being authoritarian that's motivating the strategy. But I would say that the two most important lines in this work that you can read online come on page 8 and unfortunately on page 24. The one that is most relevant to what I was just talking about here is where the administration says, we do not believe that governments and societies everywhere must be remade in America's image for us to be secure. And so that leaves room for states that aren't pristine or don't already have a lot of experience with cooperating with US to cooperate with us on certain things. And these kind of capacity building exercises are, I think, really, really important ways that we can make a difference. But we can also learn ourselves. We have a lot to learn from other countries about how systems can work better and how communities can work well. One of the things that I'm noticing as I study and learn more about global environmental challenges is, a lot of countries in less developed, a lot of governments in less developed countries and communities in less developed countries have a lot of experience getting over natural disasters. And they have quite resilient communities on kick into force when they have a disaster. We don't really have that experience. We rely a lot on the organizations like FEMA, US Red Cross, and so we can learn a lot from other countries about the way that they develop capacity. This kind of sharing.
All right, thank you.
To what extent is it justifiable for a world power like the United States to act independently of multinational organizations in its democracy promotion efforts?
I'll take a quick stab. What was the word you used? Is it acceptable? What is justifiable? Yeah, I would say it's going to happen. So personally, I don't get too hung up on whether we can justify it in terms of some, I don't know, international law or norm, because those kind of things are not as strong as, our, frankly, our own self-interest. Thank you for both of them. Really not in the United States self-interest. Really, however you define it, you shove democracy down somebody else. Either from, the point of view of our own security, say, 20 years after the Iraq invasion, or from the point of view of, slowly chipping away support for the United States. Because, we've sanctioned so many countries, or, shown that we have been hypocritical, the ways that we do. So I think it's inevitable that we will work outside of multilateral institutions sometimes. Personally, I hope we'll just be smarter about how we do everything in and out of multilateral institutions.
Yeah, multilateral institutions, they have a real mixed record. I spent 4 years in the my primary customers. I'm working with the High Commissioner. And when you have an organization like that, where you have members like that are supposed to be promoting human rights, that includes Syria, Burma, Saudi Arabia, China, Russia, that are actively working on the working of the UN, various special rapporteurs and commissioners on human rights issues, democracy, promotion. And I think, yeah, it's perfectly justifiable for the United States outside of the UN to do that. Sometimes you have to lead, sometimes you have to put. Again, I think the point you both made is be a lot smarter about the way to do that. I mean, if you can list it, or the African Union, Commonwealth, or any number of other multilateral organizations, you have a little bit more moral authority to make it happen. But those organizations often don't move. And so you have a choice. You simply say, well, UN's not going to do it, or the African Union is going to sit on its hands over South Sudan, or do you try to do something? And we have made a determination, usually working with a like-minded group of other countries, working. And I do think that I will be the case with those organizations.
Thank you. I agree with that. I think it's really important not to give up on multilateral institutions. But I think it's also important to realize how long it takes to work through those institutions. For example, we just now, in the last several weeks, got this UN General Assembly resolution where 60% of UN member states condemned Russia's attack on Ukraine. It took a whole year, right? And it wasn't 100% of states, but that was a real accomplishment. And it was really important information. China has more trading partners, a higher percentage of the world trades with China as its their number one trading partner than the United States. And so China, I think, has expected that will mean that the majority of countries in the world sort of follow China's lead because they have an economic self-interest. It took a year, but they got some information to the contrary, that was not going to be the only thing the countries were going to be voting on a human rights serious. Thank you.
I was wondering what your thoughts on the ideology that U.S. intervention contributed to the rise of ISIS, and do you think that all U.S. intervention?
Repeat that question, please. If you could pull the microphone down a little bit, that would help.
I was wondering what your thoughts on the ideology that U.S. intervention contributed to the rise of ISIS, and if you thought all U.S. intervention is positive.
Why don't you take that, since I made the argument that ISIS is partly a result of our invasion of Iraq.
All right, I think it should be fairly clear by now that either one of us think that all U.S. intervention is positive. It has to be smarter, certainly take local consideration into account. Part of the rise of ISIS was a very mistaken policy on the part of the United States that started with the complete depacification of Iraqi society. In other words, taking the model from when we conquered Nazi Germany, that anybody who had any connection to Nazis would be fired because we assumed they were supporters. Well, Paul Bremer, he's essentially the viceroy in Iraq, decides that anybody who had a Ba'ath Party membership would be fired from their jobs, particularly. And what that did was create basically a huge reservoir of dissatisfied people, people with a grievance, people who no longer were able to support their families, and most importantly, people who knew a lot about weaponry. And you replace that with a incompetent military. And one of the things that if you're trying to build up any military, it takes decades. This does not happen overnight. Anything that you want to invest in another country takes decades to do. We usually don't have that patience. So we are promoting a society, basically what was being seen inside of Iraq was a government that was being imposed by the outside. And that kind of opened the door. It eroded the legitimacy of the Iraqi government. And that opened the door to more extremist groups like ISIS to be able to make the argument that they're fighting not only for a free Iraq, but for a more pure form of Islam. So again, there's a wonderful book. It's out of print, it's very short. It's called Every War Must End by a gentleman named Freddie Clay. And the basic tenet is that we're really good at starting wars, we're really good at fighting wars, and we're really, in general, we're really bad at ending because we keep taking more, we just keep spending more and more no matter what the cost, even when the benefit is far gone. And that's, in a sense, what we were doing in Iraq, is what we were doing in Afghanistan. So there's always these unintended consequences. There's no such thing as a short, victorious war. Vladimir Putin is finding that out now. Every time you start to do something that involves force, there are going to be unintended consequences. ISIS, we did not.
Thank you.
I'll just jump in here quickly. These will be our last two questions.
What action do you think that in every country cause the greatest global peace?
Oh, I have. There was a study done in 2015 by the global consulting company, and they ran some models where they estimated that you could add 11% to the world GDP if you simply included more women, made it easier for women to become educated and to participate in the workforce. That 11% was actually a conservative estimate based on each country in a given region, in a continent, basically, coming up to the women's equality standards of the leading country. And they said that if all countries, met their full potential, in other words, treating men and women equally in education and economic activity, then the world would add 26% within 10 years, which is more than the size of the Chinese economy or the US economy or the European Union economy. So this is, I think, a really dramatic example of how we individually in our own lives and in supporting other people can make a huge difference in terms of human rights without changing governments dramatically or anything like that. So I would say that empowering women and in general, empowering people who have not been empowered to make their own choices just about their day-to-day lives and their economic activity will make a huge difference. It will give them more freedom, it will give them more capacity economically to deal with things like disaster prevention and disaster recovery. I'd say that's the golden ticket.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Olivia Gardner. My question is, during the Bush administration, the annual sanctions imposed on foreign governments were just under 500 per year. During Obama's administration, it was just over 500 per year, and during the Trump administration, it was just over 1,000 per year. Do you think this increase in sanctions was due to change of administration or a reflection on U.S. foreign interests?
I would say when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? We got pretty good at economic sanctions. We have kind of a playbook for economic sanctions. So that's part of the answers. The more once you get good at a certain kind of policy, you tend to churn out more of that policy, whether it's a good idea or not. The other issue, though, is that starting around the year 2000, Chinese started to sanction us as well. And so although we didn't really, it really wasn't part of sort of the top line news, the US and China began a kind of competitive economic strategy earlier than we could. Part of the story, but I think that the bigger part of the story, since your question is about the US, is that it's we know how to use it, so are overusing it just as we're overusing the military. While Chris is coming up, I'll tell you the one thing that on page 20, it's actually on page 24 of the National Security Strategy. I was really happy to see it, made it in here, that it's on page 24. Quote, it is possible for the United States and the PRC to coexist peacefully and share in and contribute to human progress together. I agree with that. I think that is the challenge of the century, and I hope you will live to see